FPL Twitter, or should I say FPLX. It's FPLMayor, who's frequently known for his threads and also just generally voicing out his analytical opinions and how he thinks about FPL, providing really sound strategy, in my opinion. So, welcome to the show.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Thanks for having me. Yeah, been playing FPL for a good few years now. Started off pretty casually with mates, as kind of most people do. Now, taking it a bit more seriously with Twitter, and yeah, I've been taking a slightly analytical approach recently. But yeah, all good fun.
Great. So, I mean, we have your draft here today. It's actually a 3-5-2 template, but I think still quite different from what people have been aligned with. Particularly, I would say if we just start with the midfield, because that's the one that catches my eye the most. You've gone for Eze over another template pick, which would be Mitoma or March even. Any reason why you've sort of switched to Mitoma Eze yourself?
Yeah, I mean that position's definitely not set. It could definitely be Matoma, but it's mainly just because the fixtures, I think I was getting a bit carried away with the first three fixtures for Brighton. I mean, they're fantastic, but after that, it gets pretty tough. So I don't want to be too heavy on Brighton, I don't think. Also, De Zerbi's talked about it, and the X minutes and that for the Brighton players could be all over the place. Obviously, Matoma you'd think would be first choice, but not quite the same as Eze, who you just imagine would get all the minutes basically and is on pens. So yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting thought as well, just because we've heard the news about how you're going to get maybe a little bit of extra time too. So recently, I think there might be a small shift in drafts where we're going to start prioritizing players who literally play from start to finish. So your Bruno Fernandes's, your Salah's of the world. And I do think one thing that Mitoma and even March might suffer from is just being an early sub. I mean, even 85 minutes is now going to be a huge difference from some people who might be playing something like 95 minutes, which is very conceivable if you actually look at the World Cup and how much added time was being added on.
yeah, for sure. And I mean, if you look at the rest of the midfield there as well, bar maybe Rashford, although I mean he's pretty good for minutes as well, but the rest of the midfield there almost as nailed as it gets for minutes. So yeah, that's certainly a shift that I've kind of taken on, and I'm sure that most will as well.
Yeah, the next thing I actually wanted to look at was, so you don't actually have triple Arsenal in your draft. I think a lot of us probably initially start with triple Arsenal, but based on some of the recent Jesus news, I think obviously we can just wait and see for the Community Shield for that, and any future Mikel Arteta press conferences. But I can see you've actually just gone for simply a 3-5-2 here with Plange as your 4.5 forward. What are your kind of thoughts on that, and moving away from what seems to be very template with a lot of people showcasing Nkunku and Jesus in a 3-4-3?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that I do end up with that. It just kind of, like you say, depends on Jesus and how fit he is. I don't particularly fancy any of the Arsenal midfielders, which is why, yeah, I'm not tripled up now. But yeah, if Jesus is fit, then there's every chance that I'll go with him, whether that be with Nkunku or without him. I'm not too sure yet, but I quite like the five-man midfield I've got there. Obviously, it could be Matoma instead of Eze, but I like the rest of it. So it'll be tough to get Jesus and Nkunku in now.
Yeah, great. And maybe speak to me about why you've gone for Blanche over someone like Mubama, who I can see on the timeline. Is there sort of like a thinking in terms of, price strategy and trying to avoid some early price drops, which could be potential, something that we saw last season as well with Archer?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely that. And unless there is a 4.5 forward who is going to play a lot, as in, say, Balogun gets a move to, I don't know, Crystal Palace or something like that. Unless that sort of thing happens, I'm not too interested in just going for the highest owned one who might get some minutes, just because I don't want to be losing out on the zero point 0.1 if kind of the masses transfer him out, which I mean at the start of the season you want to try and gain all of the value you can. So I did the same thing last season with, I can't remember whether it was a goalkeeper or a forward, but I did the same thing where I purposely didn't choose the most owned one to kind of mitigate the risk of a price drop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I also want to touch on too now, if we just move on to the defense, which is probably where you can see the template sort of backline in terms of the Estupinian, Stones, and Gabriels of the world. But at the same time, actually, I think your sort of outside options are more players like Ederson, and then even incorporating double Chelsea defense. I myself have sort of vocalized that I don't necessarily want to start with double Chelsea defense, but I can see it's getting a lot more love on the timeline as well. Is there sort of a conscious move now to look at Chelsea and their favorable fixtures and also given that you play very analytically as well? I mean, maybe speak about the Ederson pick too.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of double Chelsea, it's not something that I'm really set on again. Like I'd say I'm definitely set on Chilwell. I can't see him leaving my team in any way. The Colwill pick, that 4.5 spot could be Colwill, could be Botman. I'm less clear on that at the moment, but I guess we'll have to see kind of Colwill's minutes in whatever preseason games Chelsea have left. But yeah, that like I said, that could be Botman. Going on to Edison, yeah, I mean, people kind of like to joke about Edison and what have you, but City just are the best defense in the league, and Edison will play pretty much every single game. So for me, doubling up on City defense just makes sense, and the minutes are with Edison rather than the defenders. So yeah, I mean you're spending a little bit more, and I do like some of the 4.5 million goalkeepers. I do like Johnston quite a lot. So again, that's not necessarily locked, but the benefit with Edison is just the best defense in the league and the minutes. It seems to make sense.
Yeah, perfect. That makes sense. And maybe just in terms of just thinking about future transfer plans as well. Is there anything, in your head that you've roughly thought about? Like let's say any priority players that are within different price points that you're thinking about medium term?
I mean, Newcastle for sure. Not 100% what players from Newcastle yet. Obviously, Trippier is probably the big one, just because he's at a weird price point as well for a defender. I mean, he's a million more than the most expensive defender I've got here, so he would take some getting to. Um, but yeah, I mean Newcastle in general are the team that we'll be looking at after 3, 4, 5 game weeks. Absolutely, and that's kind of why I'm looking at Botman for that 4.5 midfielder slot, 4.5 defender slot. Sorry, just because I think I'll probably want to go quite heavy on Newcastle when we do get to the right point. So having one in place already could be quite helpful.
Yeah, perfect. And I think the biggest thing just looking at your draft here is it's more like picks like as a even ideas of going to Trippier. It's clearly suggesting that you personally like to think within more from a game week 1 to like 8 horizon as opposed to something more short term, which I think sometimes we're guilty of when we're looking at early fixtures and just thinking about making sure that we don't fall behind. But in reality, it's really good to have a team that conceivably all of these players would still be good picks by game week 6 and 7 and 8, that sort of thing. Is that something that you've for example gone to Ederson for as an example? Are you happy to for example stick with a triple city defense, or not triple city defense but a triple city that includes two city defenders in the beginning?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I do. I like to think long term. I like to plan as far ahead as kind of I can. I think it's reasonable to look, yeah, eight game weeks ahead now, which is what I've been doing with this draft. Um, and that yeah, that is why I've gone for the likes of Eze instead of Matoma potentially. It's just if you look at most of the players there, they're unlikely to be a problem unless they get an injury in 5, 6 game weeks time, which is the key. There's a few players that might be like Nkunku we don't know about too much, Colwell we don't know about too much, but for the most part, yeah, I will tend to stick to kind of safe picks so that I'm not having to use transfers on fixing things. I'd rather use them on things that I want to do rather than things that I'll need to do. In terms of triple up on City, it is something I've thought about because obviously Foden, for example, or even Alvarez, or any of the midfielder or forward options might kind of emerge as absolutely like great picks, and I need to get them, which I can't do if I'm on Triple City. So that's definitely something I've thought about, but I still just like the upside of the double defense with the fixtures that City have got to start the season.
Yeah, I suppose at the end of the day, of course, we like to think the City picks is the most explosive, but if you just look historically at total points, which I think is like a fair metric of how valuable a certain pick was over the course of a full season, you'll never tend to see that many City midfielders or even defenders at times, just because clearly the rotation threat is there. And we all love Foden, I think, on paper, but when it comes to sort of drafting an FPL team, it's sometimes hard to fit him in there. Another thing I wanted to talk about too was just saving money in the bank and the concept of that, because I know speaking to you, reviewing your drafts and some of your wild cards last season, I think a common theme was that you like to keep money in the bank. I mean, talk to me about maybe the idea of saving money in the bank in this draft as well.
Yeah, so this draft doesn't have any money in the bank. Um, I have thought about it, and the obvious ways that I would get there is Edison down to a 4.5 or Colwill down to a 4 million defender. Yeah, as you say, I like to have money in the bank to start the season. Last season, I started with 1 million in the bank. I think that it gives you a lot more flexibility if there's an option that emerges in the first week or the first 2 weeks. If you've got nothing in the bank, it can often be a lot harder to get to that player. Or if you get a problem that you need fixing, likewise, it can be harder to move to where you want to be. So I just really like the flexibility of having that extra bit of money in the bank so that I can get to any players that do emerge. And last season that did happen, albeit it was a defender or a goalkeeper. I think Edison was the player that I ended up moving to in game week 3 or 4. I think it was. I started with a 4.5. City started off really well, and I wanted to get Edison in, and I could do that because I had the 1 million in the bank.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Because obviously it feels like you're starting with what you corrected, I guess, last season, game week 4, but obviously the season completely different. If you were, let's say, to play with a 4.5 goalkeeper, I mean, who's sort of on your mind right now?
Yeah, there's a few. For me, Johnston is definitely up there. Um, he seems like he'll be the Palace keeper of choice. Palace obviously have great defensive numbers from last season. Um, so yeah, he's a great pick. Whichever Brighton keeper looks like is going to be number one, I suppose that's most likely Steele at the moment. Um, that would be obviously a great pick as well because their defensive numbers are great. I'm concerned about doubling up on their defence after game week 3, which is maybe why I potentially avoid him, but I do like him. And then also Flecken from Brentford. Again, their defensive numbers were top half last season, so I'd have no problem going with him either.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I kind of agree with you with the sort of Brighton piece, just because if you were to move off of Estupinian, it feels weird because there's not too many options at 5.0, whereas there are plenty on 5.5. So if you're sort of looking for a way out of him, it's a lot harder than let's say moving off of another 5.5, just because we have so much more variety there between Shaw, some other Chelsea defenders, even potentially another City defender if you were to go for 4.5 goalkeeper. In terms of, let's say, potentially updating your draft, or just thinking about the template, really, 3-5-2, I think, is something that you've probably been on for the most part. Is that just more a case of you can see yourself just constantly rotating some of those picks, like in Eze potentially, just because there's so many 6.5s, or are you also open to potentially a 3-4-3, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I've been on 3-5-2 for the most part. There was a couple of days where 3-4-3 looked really nice when we had we had Jesus, we had Nkunku, and Darwin looked like he might have been an interesting one. I'm always up for Darwin when he's playing. If Darwin ever looks like he's going to get minutes, then there's a very good chance that I'll be looking to get him in. But I think it's just might be a little bit too risky to start the season. Um, so that there is plenty of good strikers to make a 3-4-3 work. I mean, in a few weeks' time, we'll see the Newcastle strikers come into it. We'll see Watkins come into it. So a 3-4-3 is definitely viable. Um, and there's it's not definite that I won't actually move to it, to be honest. But for now, this just kind of seems safer. So I think this is what I'll probably end up sticking with. But yeah, the 3-4-3 could work absolute kind of wonders when Newcastle and Aston Villa fixtures turn a little bit.
Yeah, and I get what you mean completely. And I think just watching your season last year, you're probably one of the better examples of the value of playing safe and consistently as well, and what that could lead to ultimately. Because I believe you probably had a pretty poor half of the first season due to, Holland versus Salah captaincies, that sort of thing. But I mean, you still ended up in the top 5K comfortably. So that's why I think when we do discuss drafts on the timeline too, it is worth recognizing it really is a 38 game week stint. It's not like you need to get the bulk of your points in game week 1 or 2, and that's why also I think a lot of us have moved away from even considering Liverpool, because yes, game week 2 is lovely and it's a nice shiny toy, but for 38 game weeks worth of a season, it's really not that value, particularly when at the start we're planning for up to 6 to 8 weeks at the bare minimum, unless you're going for a really aggressive early wild card, which, I'm probably not likely to do myself.
No, no, me neither. Me neither. And yeah, I completely agree. If you go with the likes of if you go with the likes of Trent or if you go with the likes of Salah, there are such different price points to other players in their positions that it takes at least two transfers to switch it around back into something. Say, if you go with Salah as an example and a cheap midfielder, it takes two transfers to get it back to two mid-priced midfielders. It's there's value in kind of playing the long game in that you don't want to be behind the pack and chasing for the second half of the season. That's not a particularly good position to be in. So I think there is value in playing safe at the start. If you do kind of end up behind and you need to chase, then save that for the second half of the season potentially.
Okay, well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Really like to see actually a bit of diversity in the drafts. I feel like the templates once again starting to sort of unravel a bit. A bit of Eze, especially after a fantastic goal versus Sevilla. So, anyways, thank you so much for coming online.
Yeah, thanks for having me, mate. All the best.
All right, same to you.